Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to be, for the first time in my life, in Duke, except I would prefer to call it Duke, because old habits die hard. Now, I need to correct a little bit of the misinformation that you have just received. I am a grandfather to 5, not 4 children. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've been asked to speak to you for a while on the topic of the relevance of God, particularly in thinking of science and theology. And I understand that on this campus there's been a survey done on this topic of, do you find God relevant or irrelevant? Now, before I get into this, you will notice that I am sitting. That is a very good Russian tradition. And when I lecture in Russia, I always sit. So what you're experiencing tonight is what happens in universities all over Russia. Now, it interests me that the question is about the relevance of God. Because the first question to ask is, to what and to whom? And you will notice immediately that the use of the word relevance has got a very strong subjective overtone to it. Relevance to me, presumably. What relevance is God to me? I find that interesting coming from a university, because many of the things that you learn during your course of study here, you will never use again in your life. And yet to say they were irrelevant would be absurd. Because, ladies and gentlemen, you're come to university not for relevance, but in the pursuit of truth, of finding out things you didn't know before, and therefore discovering that many things you didn't know turn out to be enormously relevant. So I want to remove a little bit of this subjectivism tonight as I address this subject. For instance, do you personally find the square root of -1 relevant? How many of you do? Not very many, yet you wouldn't have an iPhone without it. You wouldn't have the internet about it. Now you see, not many hands went up. That's because you didn't know the facts, and so you didn't know it was relevant. And it seems to me that this is one of the crucial issues raised by our subject. I'm amazed at students all around the world who are supposed to be at university interested in truth, and yet they talk in almost purely subjective terms, what's relevant to me or what isn't relevant. To think about that for a moment, you must realize that you are not solely pursuing relevance at Duke. At least I hope you are not. Now, to step straight into our subject, there was a famous conversation between Laplace, the mathematician, and Napoleon. And Laplace had written a book on ballistic dynamics, I think it was, and Napoleon looked at this book that was full of equations. And he said to Laplace, "Where is God in your equations?" And Laplace answered, "Je n'ai pas besoin de cette hypothèse." I don't need that hypothesis. There you are, the irrelevance of God. But wait a moment. Laplace was answering the question in the right way. When I teach algebra in Oxford, I don't mention God either. Laplace was asked, where is God in the equations of ballistics? When I teach people the motion of a projectile in a vacuum, I don't mention God either. He's not relevant at that level of discourse, But suppose the question had been different. How is it, Mr. Laplace, that there is a universe that's described by your equations? That's a very different question. And God might have been very relevant to that. So we need to ask questions relevant to what, to whom, and at what level of discourse. Now, just glancing at your survey, I noticed that many students come up in this university, as they do in mine, with the standard Freudian-type argument that Richard Dawkins has embodied in his book, The God Delusion. That people find God relevant simply because they need some kind of crutch, they're lonely, they need to project the wish for a kindly father figure in the sky, and really belief in God is a kind of Freudian wish fulfillment. That's a very standard view, and I notice some of you share it. Although, interestingly enough, at least 3 or 4 times as many people in the questionnaire believed that God was relevant than God was not. Now, we need to think about this Freudian thing before it gets in our way. If there is no God, then Freud gives you a brilliant argument that religion is a product of wish fulfillment. That is, if there is no God. But of course, if there is a God, religion gives you Freud gives you an equally brilliant argument why atheism is a wish fulfillment. The desire not to meet God or not to be judged by him. And there's a wonderful book written by Manfred Lutz, a German psychiatrist, one of the top psychiatrists. It's called Eine kleine Geschichte des Größten. Perhaps you think Germans are relevant, and so you don't know what that means. It means a brief history of the great one. And he says in it, he uses these 2 arguments, but he says, on the question whether there is a God or not, Freud cannot help you at all. You will have to look elsewhere for evidence. So we need to be aware that these wish fulfillment arguments are practically useless because they can be used in both directions and they cancel each other out. Now, it has been suggested to me that I tell you why I think God is relevant to science. Well, I think it's far bigger than that. I believe, ladies and gentlemen, there is a God. That is the truth about this universe. Because I'm not actually interested in God if it's simply some projection of imagination that's possibly relevant to me. I'm interested in finding out truth. I was brought up in Northern Ireland, which is unfortunately quite a sectarian country, but my parents were very unusual. They were Christian without being sectarian, and they taught me the pursuit of truth. They loved me enough to let me think. So when I came to Cambridge, I wasn't full of the baggage that many of my fellow students were involved with, and I wanted to know the truth. And I rapidly discovered that looking at this universe, we all ask these questions. What is ultimate reality? Is it, as the new atheists say, this material universe? Or is it God? Now, there are other alternatives of the pantheistic variety, but I'm just going to concentrate on those 2 because in most of our major Western universities, those are the 2 worldviews that are most strongly represented. Ultimate reality is mass energy. And mass energy, since it is ultimate reality, must, by definition, be the explicator of everything exists, including life and mind and the idea of God, because, of course, there isn't a God. The other worldview is the worldview that we call theism, that believes that this universe is not all that exists, but there is a God who created it and sustained it. Now, these are highly relevant questions, ladies and gentlemen, because they barrel up to us through history, they bite into our society, and whichever way you sit on one of those 2 worldviews has got a massive influence on your behavior right at this very moment, whether you've analyzed it or not. Worldviews are immensely important. And what you're doing, at least I hope what you're doing at Duke, is that you are building up your own worldview. You're testing the answers to the big questions for yourself. And that's what this evening is about, to give you the opportunity of meeting someone like me, and you probably meet Richard Dawkins on another occasion, putting towards you the conviction, not that the Christian worldview is relevant, but it's actually true. And therefore, it may be ignorance on your part that makes you think it's not relevant at all. You simply don't know why it should be relevant. And of course, it might have been interesting to reverse the survey and do it about the relevance of atheism as well, just to balance it. Now, coming to science itself, why do I think that science points towards God? Because this is the basic question. You see, there's a myth going around that science and religion are inimical, that Christians have always been anti-intellectual. They've been fighting against people like Galileo and all this kind of stuff. Now, if you think that, please do a bit of history, because it's easy to forget that Galileo was a believer before he started and he was a believer when he finished. And actually, Galileo was not first attacked by the Roman Catholic Church. He was first attacked by the Italian philosophers. And why was that? Because they all believed in Aristotle. They believed that the earth was fixed in the center of the universe. And so the irony of the whole thing was the Catholic Church had tied itself to Aristotle and so weighed in with Galileo when they saw the philosophers weighing in. But we know that Galileo was right and they were wrong. So it was a believer in God and in Scripture who was making this huge advance in science. So it is mythological, as my colleagues in the history of science at Oxford have pointed out to me many times. It's mythological to use this as a paradigmatic case for the conflict metaphor of religion versus science. It simply doesn't work at all. And the myth is, according to one leading historian of science, however this conflict myth got going in the first place. The real question, ladies and gentlemen, is this. It's not, as I see it, a conflict between science and belief in God. It's a conflict between these two worldviews, materialism or naturalism on the one side, which unite in their disavowing of the supernatural dimension. I am against supernatural gods, says Richard Dawkins. On the other side is theism, and in my case, Christian theism, which asserts the existence of a supernatural God. Now, if this is the biggest thing in the universe, to suggest it's irrelevant is absurd, of course. And so it's worthwhile thinking a little bit before we decide about relevance or irrelevance, what we believe to be true or not. Now, of course, I meet a lot of people that tell me there's no such thing as truth, but they expect me to believe that what they have just told me is truth. Which is astonishing because they don't realize, and that's a characteristic of postmodernism, you'll notice it everywhere, that the person making the statement excludes themselves from its implications. That won't do. Scientists are more modest. They don't claim to be bringing you absolute truth, but they do believe there's truth out there and that their science is getting a closer and closer handle on it. And most of us, I think, go along with that. They may be postmodern in other areas, but not in their science. So let's just have a look at the ways in which, some of the ways in which, briefly, confusion arises. Because many young people, and I'm sure you faced it too, are being presented today with the alternative of God or science in this whole discussion. God is not relevant because science shows that God doesn't exist, and you've got to choose between the two. Now, that arises from so many mistakes that it's hard to detail them all tonight, but let me mention one or two of them. The first is it proceeds from a false concept of God. It proceeds from the notion that God is a God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. Now, if you believe in a God like that, of course, the more of God, the less of science. The more of science, the less of God. But I've never met a Christian that believes in a God of the gaps. God is the God of the whole show. When Isaac Newton discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, oh, wonderful, I've got an equation that governs it. I don't need God. No. What he did was to write the most brilliant book in the history of science, the Principia Mathematica, expressing the hope explicitly that it would persuade the thinking person to believe in God. In other words, the more he understood of science, the more he worshipped the God whose genius did it that way. And that is precisely my own position. In other words, the more I know of how this universe works, the more I admire the genius who is God. How could I help not doing so? So that means, of course, ladies and gentlemen, that God is not competing with science as an explanation, any more than Henry Ford is competing with the laws of internal combustion and mechanical engineering as an explanation for a Ford Galaxy motor car. And you know, it amazes me that some of the most intelligent people in the world, even children, I go to schools, and 13-year-olds can immediately see that if you've got a motor car, a Ford car, and you offer two kinds of explanations, law and mechanism and Henry Ford, those explanations are both necessary, but they complement and they don't contradict each other. I find children can see it. Professors are a different matter. Now, God's relevance to science takes on very subtle forms. And the one I want to mention tonight is the fact that the very fact we can do science raises all kinds of very interesting questions indeed. Now let me say before I go into that I do not believe that science is the only way to truth. That is the view that we call scientism. It is demonstrably false because it consists in a logical incoherency. If I make the statement science is the only way to truth, that is not a statement of science, so if it's true, it's false. Have you got that, or is it too late for logic? Probably too late for logic. But anyway, it goes too far. And it's very important that we realize that, because we are in an age where everything wants to describe itself as a science. The hard sciences don't normally use the word science in their description. Mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology. But then we get the word science attached to other disciplines. Why is that done? Because people feel increasingly that science is the only way to truth. But that's nonsense. If science is the only way to truth, you'd have to close half your faculties at Duke. History, economics, and all these vastly important topics, literature and so on, would have to shut. Science is our way of knowing, and by restricting its questions, it has been phenomenally successful. But to deify it, as is being done at the moment, and saying it's the only way to truth is not only self-contradictory, it is demonstrably completely false. But since my topic is science and faith, and you notice that topic? Science and faith. I wonder what you think the word faith means in that context. I bet you don't think it's anything to do with science. It's science here and faith there. Well, that's wrong for a start. Because faith is involved in science. And one of the things that the new atheists have done brilliantly is to confuse people about what faith is. What they say is that faith is believing where there isn't any evidence, and it's a religious concept. So when they meet me, Richard Dawkins calls me a man of faith. That isn't a compliment, it's an insult. Because what he means is that Professor Lennox believes where not only is there no evidence, he knows there's no evidence. That has meant that the new atheists do not take seriously the evidence that Christians offer to them, which is demonstrable from the God delusion. If I took my information about biology from a professor of German, I think Richard Dawkins would squawk, wouldn't he? But yet he is deriving information from anesthesiologists about the existence of Jesus. It is amazing to me, ladies and gentlemen, because the cardinal sin in the world in which I work is when you go outside your professional field, which I'm doing tonight, when you go outside your professional field, you must investigate the best evidence that comes from the opposing point of view. I've spent my life doing it all around the world. But it seems that the new atheists don't bother. Why? Because they think that those of us who believe in God close our minds, give up our intellect, and we believe for there's no evidence. And that leads them into another massive error. They do not realize that faith is involved in the scientific endeavor at a profound level. Einstein, who was quite bright, as you know, Einstein said he couldn't imagine a scientist without what he called that profound faith. And what he was talking about was the belief that you can do science. You see, isn't it amazing that here's a mathematician, and he's thinking in his head, thinks up some equations, and lo and behold, they seem to interact with the universe out there. How does that work? Perhaps you've never thought about it. But really bright people do, like Eugene Wigner, who won the Nobel Prize. And he wrote a famous paper about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Now, what did he mean by that? He couldn't figure out how something going on in the human mind could apply to the universe out there. Now, when we think about it, why should I, as a scientist, trust my mind? Here we are tonight, listening to what I hope is a rational discourse. You are relying on your mind from the beginning of this lecture to the end to give you information that's processable, that's understandable. But what's the basis of that, ladies and gentlemen? How does that work? Don't you realize it's astonishing? In fact, it's even more astonishing if you now look at it at the level of the two worldviews. What does the worldview of naturalistic atheism have to say about it? Well, I tell you what it has to. And it starts with Charles Darwin. He wrote this: "With me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind?" Now, this statement is being constantly and currently analyzed by some of the leading philosophers in the world. Because you see, there is an irony here. I asked my colleagues in Oxford about the mind. I said, what do you think the mind is? Well, they say the mind is the brain. It's a purely physical thing, okay? And what's the brain? Well, it's the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Oh, I said, why would you trust anything it says? I mean, let me put it to you. If the computer you use in your office, if you knew it was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you use it? Of course you wouldn't. This is a remarkable thing. Here are these people using their minds to tell me that the mind is nothing but a collection of sophisticated motions of elementary particles. And long ago, a very famous chemist saw the problem with that. He said, if the thoughts in my mind are just the motions of atoms in my brain, a mechanism that has arisen by mindless, unguided processes, why should I believe anything it tells me, including the fact that it's made of atoms? In other words, ladies and gentlemen, my chief objection to the atheist worldview is that, not that it's against God, that's obvious it's against God, is that it's against rationality, the rationality I need to do science. I believe that science explains, but to quote philosopher Richard Swinburne, I postulate God to explain why science explains. Because you see, atheistic reductionism removes thought to the firing of synapses and neurons and, of course, does away with meaning, as people are increasingly seeing. Because if you think of things solely in terms of material processes, you get stuck, don't you? Because here is the supreme irony. We live in an age that's characterized in science, for many people, by materialism in terms of philosophy. But you see, our scientific theories, our thoughts, are not physical processes. They are abstract ideas which are not material. And to take that a little bit further, we live, ladies and gentlemen, in the information age. Information isn't physical, It isn't material. And the grand irony to my mind is people have been trying now for some hundreds of years to keep God out and to keep any notion of supernatural, above the material. And now it's creeping in the most unexpected place as a fundamental doctrine of physics. Fascinating, isn't it? Because you know, and I say this everywhere I go because I feel it's very important, the moment you see letters and writing, you immediately infer upwards to a mind, whatever the physical processes involved, and you may not know them, producing the writing on the page in front of you. You infer that there's a mind behind it. And I find it very striking that when I say to my colleagues at Oxford, think of the longest word we've ever discovered, the human genome, 3.5 billion letters, 4-letter alphabet, every one in the right order, with multiple dimensions of information beyond its linear semiotic code, and people say chance and necessity to explain it. And they see their own name written on a beach in Carolina, and immediately they postulate a mind. There's something funny going on, isn't there? And it raises very big questions for me, and I've written about them at length, and you'll find them on my website, johnlennox.org, and in my book, God's Undertaker. You see, ladies and gentlemen, this brings me in a circle, really, because it brings me to the fact of these two worldviews. The first one starts with mass energy and explains everything bottom up in terms of mass energy. The second one goes like this. In the beginning was the Word, logos, intelligence, mind. All things came to be through him. And it's that one that makes far more sense to me as a scientist than the materialistic one. Is it relevant? Vastly relevant. Because it gives a basis. And you see, look at the history of science. Do you know what the motto of your university is? Eruditio et religio. You ever think about it? The people that built this university at Oxford, my university, Dominus est illuminata mea, God is my light. Or Harvard, Veritas, Christo et ecclesiae, truth for Christ and the church. It's interesting, isn't it? And it's telling you something about your own intellectual history, which we forget, and it's this. That modern science as we know it exploded out of a Christian worldview. It didn't happen in China. Technology did. And a famous chemist who was a brilliant Chinese expert wrote the definitive history of Chinese science, Joseph Needham. He tried for years, because he was a Marxist, to explain the non-rise of anything like contemporary science in China by Marxist principles. And he ended up giving it up, and he said, I think the difference lies in this, that they did not have the unifying concept of a creator. Is belief in God relevant? Ladies and gentlemen, any of you doing science, it was belief in God catapulted your subject into its contemporary form. I'm not remotely ashamed of being a Christian and a scientist. In fact, it's the other way around, because Christianity gave me my subject. And as C.S. Lewis brilliantly put it, men became scientific because they believed in law and nature, and they believed in law and nature because they believed in a lawgiver. I quoted Darwin to start with to raise the question about the cognition. I'm now going to quote someone rather surprising. Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most influential thinkers that there's been. But listen to this. Only if we assume a God who is morally like us can truth and the search for truth be at all something meaningful and promising of success. This God left aside, the question is permitted whether being deceived is not one of the conditions of life. Nietzsche saw that if you get rid of God, you get rid of truth, ladies and gentlemen. And in the end, you undermine science. Now, don't misunderstand me. I have met the most brilliant people in the world who are atheists, top of mathematics, in Russia particularly. Atheists do brilliant science. I met believers in God, like Bill Phillips, physics Nobel Prize winner in the United States. He's a believer in God, and he does brilliant science. It's not a question of whether you can do the science or not. Because from where I sit as a Christian, every one of you, whether you believe it or not, is a man or woman made in the image of God, and therefore with these rational faculties. What is lacking, as Alvin Plantinga of Notre Dame puts it so well, is the warrant for that belief. Now, there are other things I could say. I promised to try to be about 35 minutes. We started late, so in the words of the TV show, I'll finish late. I want to say one or two more things, because the relevance of God these days to science seems to me to be obvious, and it needs to be brought back into the domain of discussion at the level in which I've suggested it. But there's another burgeoning field where there is a lot of intellectual inquiry. The new atheists are, of course, very interested in it because they realize that for centuries, in the West at least, morality has been based on the Bible. If you reject God, you'll have to find your morality from elsewhere. And that's proving extremely difficult. In fact, a warning has been issued by Germany's leading intellectual, Jürgen Habermas, in his book Übergänge, which means transitions. He says we need to be careful here because our human rights legislation, our educational institutions, as I've just seen, our hospices, our hospitals, all derive from the Judeo-Christian tradition. All of them. The things we value. And he warns, and he's an atheist, he warns people from trying to get rid of these things because he says everything else, and this is, I repeat, an atheist German intellectual, everything else is just idle postmodern chatter. That's not me, that's him. And what he is warning is this, that if religion is attacked, we'll eventually cut people off from meaning. Now, I've experienced this. You see, ladies and gentlemen, I started saying that from a boy, I wanted to know the truth. It's cost me a lot of effort. It's cost me learning both German and Russian and spending many, many, many months in particularly East Germany during the Cold War, talking to people, and in Russia ever since the wall came down many, many times, in the academies of science and so on and so forth. And it's very interesting to see what systematic atheism does to a society when it comes to this question of morality. And for many of my Russian friends, Dostoevsky is a prophet. And you remember he wrote, Если Бога нет, то и всё позволено, which, as you all know, means, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. Now, Dostoevsky did not mean that people who do not believe in God cannot behave morally. That's absurd. Sometimes my atheist friends can put me to shame. What he did mean is, just as there's no logical justification or warrant for doing science if there's no God, so there is no warrant for morality. It becomes a matter of opinion if there is no God. And that is the thing that is being wrestled with. Michael Ruse, for example, Neo Wilson, who will be well known to you, writing that morality is an illusion fobbed off by our genes onto us to get us to create. So morality is immoral by definition. Well, that really won't do. But you see, ladies and gentlemen, we are in a moral crisis in our world today. We see it in my country very much. Young people don't know where they are because people are trying to base their morality down here and in the world. And if you start basing your morality, for instance, on animal behavior, you can build any morality you like. Darwin observes that ants cooperate. There's a base for altruism, some people say. Oh no, said Spencer, it's the struggle for survival. And we've seen that work out in history, haven't we? In business and everywhere else in politics, the struggle for survival. And both sides, truth tends to be getting in the way. So it seems to me, ladies and gentlemen, you see, that the relevance of God is enormous. Listen to Richard Dawkins talk about morality. This universe is just as you'd expect it to be. If at the bottom there is no good, there is no evil, there is no justice, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So the shooters in the Georgia Tech are just dancing to the music of their DNA. The men that flew the planes into the Twin Towers are just dancing to the music of their DNA. That's the end of morality, ladies and gentlemen. And I would just suggest to you, as students of one of the premier universities in this nation, that you think carefully where the new atheist bus is going before you get on it. Very carefully indeed. So I want to give you time for questions. There's lots of other things, but perhaps they'll come up at the question time. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being so patient.
Have been out on the plaza for a few weeks collecting responses to the question, is God irrelevant? And if so, why? And if you don't mind, we have a few questions that if you could give your responses to some of the leading ideas of why God is irrelevant to this campus and to students in general. So first, what would you respond to someone who said the discussion of God is irrelevant because his existence cannot be proven?
Well, I would say there are several confusions there to start with. The first is the use of the word proof. Proof has two meanings at least. One is in pure mathematics, and you never get it outside pure mathematics, not even in physical science. In pure mathematics, in an axiomatic system in particular, you can start with a given set of axioms, with a given set of rules of inference, and you can be sure your conclusions are correct. You do not get that anywhere else. So that proof in the informal sense tends to have a more forensic character. Prove beyond reasonable doubt. Let's give you pointers. I cannot prove to you mathematically x plus y equals z, take the negative third square root that my wife loves me. But I can give you masses of evidence. And that's the first thing to be got over in the formulation of this question. To say that the existence of God cannot be proven in this sense is an absolute statement. The next thing I would want to ask, how do you know? Have you considered the evidence? And I would start with some of the evidence I've given to you tonight, and then I would proceed. And I would talk about the evidence, one, of the fact we can do science, then some of the evidence that comes from the fine-tuning of the universe, which would take another lecture to explain, but then I've written a little book about it, and you can have a look at that, called God and Stephen Hawking. That leads me to think that there is a grand designer, although he believes there isn't. And then I would look at the question of history and experience. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the parameters of a talk like the one I have given tonight are really the parameters of theism versus atheism. But you see, the major reason for me believing in God is not my science. That's just part of it. But the major reason for me believing in God is Jesus Christ. And that focuses things right into the center of history. And so you have to allow the evidence of history. I'm very keen on history. I think we need more historians, by the way. It is a hugely important discipline. And that focuses down onto questions of the main one, of course. The central claim of the Christian faith is that Jesus is God, and that the main piece of evidence, proof, if you like, in the informal sense, is that he rose from the dead. Now, we could begin to go into that if you want me to, but the point is that as a scientist, I believe it. I do not accept, and if you watch my debate with Hitchens or read any of my books, I've got a huge chapter in 2 of my books on why I reject the notion that David Hume put about, that miracles are violations in the laws of nature, and therefore it is impossible for an intellectual to believe in them. I think that is very poor argument. And in fact, the world expert on David Hume, Anthony Flew, who died not long ago, I had a lengthy interview with him before he died. He was the Richard Dawkins of a previous age. And he told me privately, he said, I was totally wrong about David Hume. Totally wrong. All my books would have to be rewritten, but unfortunately I'll never get there. So I would want to talk about that kind of evidence, the objective evidence of history, if you like, and the subjective evidence of having experience of God in my life through the last 50 or 60 years. That would be a start.
Thank you. Okay. Next up. So while we might accept that discoveries in the physical and natural sciences may indicate or increase one's belief in a sort of deistic or order-making God, discoveries in the social sciences and the mass injustices and inequalities that we see seem to preclude the possibility of a loving God. So what would you respond to someone who asked, why could God make an orderly and beautiful universe but not an orderly and beautiful humanity?
The answer to that is longer than the previous answer. Because she's asked the hardest question of all. This is the hard one. And it's interesting that you go straight for that. And I appreciate being asked it, because the notion of God as the great mathematician and the beauty of nature and so on, many of my colleagues react exactly like that. And this is what they say to me. They say, look, maybe there is evidence of a big design, the beauty of mathematics, the fact that we can do it is marvelous. But please don't talk to me about a personal God. I cannot look at the world today and believe when I see the disorder, the pain, the suffering, the tsunamis, the cancers, and all the rest of it. I cannot believe in God. Now let me tell you straight, ladies and gentlemen, I feel that problem very keenly. And I don't have any simplistic answers to it. Not in the sense of a nice little neat philosophical thing, because, well, there are many reasons for that. But the first reason is the question has at least 3 or 4 distinct aspects. Firstly, there is, of course, the problem of pain, to be distinguished from the problem of moral evil. A tsunami isn't a moral evil, nor is an earthquake. And I arrived in New Zealand 2 days after the earthquake happened. And within a few days had to meet people who'd lost their relatives. Had to speak to all the pastors in Christchurch. If you're interested in how I responded in that situation, being plunged into it, just Google my name in New Zealand. There's a whole web page with lectures on radio, television, in the universities, all over the place, where some of the biggest crowds came that had ever been seen in New Zealand. And I tried to deal with this. So it's very much on my heart. And let me put it to you, forgive me being personal, because it is really a personal thing. And if you don't want a personal answer, just go to sleep for a minute. But a few years ago, I was rushed into hospital, and they just managed to save my life in the last few seconds. I said goodbye to my wife. We thought that was it. And people say, isn't that wonderful, you know? God really did something, didn't he? He saved you. And I said, well, yes, I'm very grateful for that. But in the same month, my sister's 22-year-old just married daughter had an earthquake in her brain, and it killed her. Do I rejoice that God saved me and my sister lost her daughter? If I've got nothing to say to her, I better shut up about myself, haven't I? So, the next thing to be borne in mind is that this has 2 aspects. There's an intellectual aspect. How can you believe in a God when? But there's a pastoral aspect. People are hurting. And when I'm talking to an audience like this, there'll be many of you that are really hurting with things like this. And you're not finding easy answers. And to have someone like me come out and say, well, the answer is X plus Y equals Z, and therefore that would be absurd. Let me put it this way. Cancer looks very different to an oncologist than it does to the young girl who's just been told she's 3 months to live. Now, how do we face these things, ladies and gentlemen? Well, some say there is no God. That's it. DNA just is. We dance to its music. And Dawkins says it's bleak. And incidentally, Peter Singer, who uses this argument a great deal, I debated him. It's on ABC Television Australia. Peter Singer of Princeton, but I debated him in Australia. And this is the big thing that he cannot face. And so we had a massive public discussion about it, which you can watch. So how do we begin to approach it? Well, one solution is to say there's no God. But I notice that that isn't quite a solution because it leaves the pain and the suffering. It does remove all hope by definition. And I mean that seriously, ladies and gentlemen. Because atheism is obliged to hold that death is the end. And whatever you make of the question of suffering that causes the innocent to die, atheism means that there's no hope. And the vast majority of people on this earth are not living like you're living. And there'll be thousands dead who were alive at the beginning of my lecture. We've got to face it now. So what I say to people is, you imagine you've solved the problem. I have a problem because I still believe in God. Now I want to tell you why I believe in God in this context, very briefly. This is a big topic, and it's a very serious topic. Why do I believe in God? Well, there are two ways of approaching it. And the question hints at the philosophical way. Well, I've argued it, and I think it's very important. There is the free will defense, as argued by C.S. Lewis, Alvin Plantinga, and I think there's an awful lot going for that. That at the moral level doesn't answer the problem of pain. At the moral level, you cannot have love in a robotic universe. If I went home to my wife and there were buttons all down, kiss one, kiss two, and so on and so forth, and pressed her and got a robotic kiss, it wouldn't be worth much, would it? If you're going to create the possibility for a person that says yes, by definition, you've got to have the possibility of saying no. And perhaps you can imagine God's dilemma, because I faced it when I had my children. I remember thinking about it. When the first little child lay in my arms, I thought, you could grow up to say no to me and reject me. It's a real possibility. Why do I bring kids into the world then? Why do I think that risk is worthwhile? And you can then explore that avenue, which is very important. We do take risks in order to have something that's very precious. But I'm not going to go down that line because it would take far too long. What I'm going to come back to is this. We could, two of us, or a whole group of us, could argue from now for the next 100 years. A good God should, would, might, could, possibly, ought to do this, that, and the other thing, and argue back and forward and back and forward. And nobody's really got anywhere, have they? So I try to ask myself another question. It's this. Granted that life is jagged and raw, and there are broken edges, there are broken hearts, there are broken minds, there are broken limbs, there are broken bodies, broken dreams. That's what life is like. Granted that it's like that, is there anywhere any evidence that God can be trusted with that? And my answer to that is a simple one, ladies and gentlemen. The heart of Christianity is the cross. And I've said to many people who are hurting, I've stood in Auschwitz many times and wept every time. I've said to many people who are hurting, I know it's difficult for you. You may have been brought up to think this is absurd, but just think for a moment. Just conceive for a moment in your head that it might just be true that Jesus is God. God become human, the Word become flesh, God incarnate. Just for a moment think it might be possible. What's God doing on a cross? Well, it tells me this at least, that God has not remained distant from human suffering, but has become part of it. Now, if that's what God's like, ladies and gentlemen, I think I begin to see a little window opening up into a possibility that possibly I could trust a God like that. especially when you add to it the fact that his death was not the end. He rose from the dead. And if in this universe there is evidence that someone has broken the death barrier, this, by definition, is the most relevant thing you could ever hear. To say it's irrelevant is to totally misunderstand what's going on, because every one of us fear death. If there is a possibility of getting to know in a personal way the God that loved me and gave himself for me, you never thought you'd hear an Oxford professor say that, did you? The biggest thing in my life, ladies and gentlemen, facing those problems, is I see sufficient evidence to trust God, because I see evidence that he loves me and he values me. That's why I'm a Christian. Christ isn't competing with anybody else because no one offers me what he does. That was a moderately long answer.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for your presentation, Professor. Let's all give Dr. Lennox a hand.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.